Roof, and I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's debate. This debate is sponsored by the Diana Davis Spencer Foundation, and it's the last debate in ISI's annual Great Ideas Debate Series. I'd like to thank the Diana Davis Spencer Foundation for their generosity in making our debate series possible and for helping restore a culture of rigorous debate on college campuses. We are excited to be finishing our debate series this year here tonight after another successful year of bringing debates to campuses across the country, focused on some of the most pressing issues in America today and tied to the deepest commitments and principles that have sustained our civilization. And when universities have forgotten these things by committing to radical theories that divorce us from our history and traditions, it's so essential to restore and participate in forums like these. So thank you all for being here. ISI for the last 70 years has been educating for liberty through our various offerings of debates like these, seminars, which we've hosted in the past year here at UT, on-campus lectures, sponsorship of campus groups, and our various national programs. If you would like to become more involved with ISI and help us restore the principles of virtue and freedom and ordered liberty in America and on our college campuses, come see me after the debate or visit our website at isi.org. And I'd also like to take a quick moment to thank our partners at the Civitas Institute, who have done a lot of the work tonight to make it possible for you all to be here. The Civitas Institute is a community of scholars dedicated to the principles that enable a free society to flourish. Like ISI, Civitas's core values are constitutionalism, individual rights, and free enterprise. And we at ISI are proud to be co-sponsoring this event with them, and I'm told that the feeling is mutual. And if you're local to the area, I highly encourage you to get more involved with the Civitas Institute. A quick note on the order of operation for tonight. Each speaker will have 7 minutes for opening remarks. First from Noah Rothman, and then followed by Michael Anton. And then Dan McCarthy will lead a moderated discussion and crossfire for about 30 minutes. And then we will get to your questions in the audience. Dan will remind you of this, I'm sure, but I'll say it now. Don't give a statement as a question. Keep your questions short. Make sure there's a question mark at the end of it so we can get to as many as possible. And then at the end, each speaker will have a 5-minute closing statement, which will then be followed by voting. And for those of you who signed up at the ISI website, there is a QR code that will go to your email, whether you're watching at home virtually or here in person. And if you need the QR code or you don't get it in your email, it's in the back when you come in. So you can scan it on your phone and fill out your vote, cast your vote before you leave tonight. And with that, without further ado, I will introduce the speakers and then turn it over to them. Arguing in the affirmative tonight is Noah Rothman, who is a senior writer at National Review. He's the author of 2 books. First, The Rise of the New Puritans, Fighting Back Against the Progressives' War on Fun, and Unjust, Social Justice and the Unmaking of America. Arguing in the negative, Michael Anton is a lecturer and research fellow at Hillsdale College, a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute, and a former national security official in the Trump administration. He is also the author of the well-known Flight 93 election, which helped make the then candidate Trump a more intellectually respectable candidate, as well as author of The Stakes, America at the Point of No Return. And our moderator tonight is my colleague, Daniel McCarthy, who is the vice president for the Collegiate Network at ISI and editor of ISI's journal, Modern Age, which has a new website, modernagejournal.com, which features more daily content. There are also copies of Modern Age's recent print edition at our table out in the back when you walked in, and Dan welcomes you to take a copy home with you tonight. And with that, I will turn it over to these 3 gentlemen who will lead us in our debate. I hope you enjoy. Thank you very much.
Shall I begin? I'll begin. Thank you very much to Civitas and ISI for hosting us, Dan for moderating, and Michael for sparring with me today. At the risk of being a cliche, I'm going to begin with a brief quote from Ronald Reagan's 1985 State of the Union address. "We must stand by our democratic allies, and we must not break faith with those who are risking their lives to defy Soviet-supported aggression and secure the rights which have been ours from birth. The United States must rebuild its credibility and its commitment to resist Soviet encroachment on US interests and those of our allies and friends. Soviet Union may be gone, but Russia's interest in subsuming its partners, rather its neighbors, into an imperial covenant is not gone. This quote, seemed axiomatic to me in 2008, 2009, 2010, when I was getting a graduate degree in international relations with a focus on the post-Soviet space and security policy. This is right after Russia had invaded Georgia, carved up portions of that country, and created little fiefdoms, which were functionally part of the Russian imperial design. And I was in my graduate program, and I was arguing at that point for something resembling a containment strategy for the modern Russia, and I was getting looks from my professors as though I was a crazy person. This quite obviously had nothing to do with Russian imperial ambitions. This is at the height of the Obama era Russian reset policy, where we were sacrificing obligations to, for example, the Czech Republic and Poland in exchange for nothing at all. And it seemed to me that it was necessary to contain, obviously, Russian aggression. And my professors informed me, in my naivete, that Russian aggression was purely a species of a reaction to George W. Bush's cowboy hat unilateralism. It was quite obvious to them that Russia was doing nothing other than following the precedents that America had set. And this rang true to me. I'd been in conservative media for some time. This remark sounded to me like a kind of familiar progressive chauvinism, a belief that the United States is the author and the arbiter of all bad things that happen abroad. And it's the sort of thing I was used to hearing from progressives. And I increasingly hear it today from the populist right. Russia's war in Ukraine did not begin in 2022, did not begin in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea, and deniably in the Donbass following the pro-Russian president at the time effort to ignore the efforts by the Donbass, the parliament at the time, to integrate the country into the European economic sector. It began in 2004 and 2005 when Russia began a campaign of covert operations and economic warfare and energy warfare designed to destabilize the state. It did not stop at Ukraine's borders. Indeed, Russia had been engaged in pretty aggressive cyber attacks in places like Estonia. And even in 2014, when they invaded Crimea, Russia, that same year, inaugurated a rather brazen cross-border campaign in which it used radar jamming technology and smoke signals, or smoke grenades rather, and infiltrated the border, captured a border guard, brought him back to Moscow and put him on trial because Moscow has not ever observed this bright red line that supposedly delineates NATO allies and those states that are on the periphery that we have ignored. Today, there is a lot of consternation over what Ukraine's war aims are, and that the idea that they are no longer achievable. But we should focus in as much on Russia's war aims, and we do not, at the risk, I think, of a coherent strategy. The notion here is that the only obstacle to a negotiated settlement of this conflict, or continued stalemate even on the battlefield, is Ukraine's will to resist. And I don't see any evidence of that in Russia's conduct. Moscow seems to have as its objective going as far into Ukraine, towards the Dnipro, and even towards NATO's borders as it can. And the prospect of a Ukrainian collapse is something we should be very concerned about. The idea that NATO's allies on the frontier and the periphery would simply accept that strikes me as fanciful. I think there would be a panic, the like of which we probably have not seen. And the threat is that Moscow gets close enough or engineers the prospects of something like a failed state in Ukraine that our NATO allies in Bulgaria and Romania and Poland and Hungary and the Baltic states would simply not accept. Indeed, we might see something like an insurgency in what would appear from the outside to be a failed state. And you can look it up in the New York Times prior to Russia's invasion in 2022. This was the Biden administration's plan. According to the New York Times reporting, they were lobbying the government in Kyiv, which they expected to fall very quickly, to open up the arms stocks. Just let the civilians have at it and create some sort of an insurgency inside Ukraine. This strikes me as absolutely mad, because I don't believe that the states that remember Soviet domination would accept something like a failed state on their borders. That prospect introduces infinite more complexity to this conflict, far more chance for a conflagration that we cannot manage, and ties down America's assets and resources in Europe at the request of our allies, and prevents us from having the kind of freedom of movement that we would need to navigate the 21st century's growing conflicts. There's a reason why a lot of our allies in the Pacific, Seoul, Tokyo, Taipei, are all lobbying very hard for us to continue to support Ukraine. The world's land-hungry dictators are watching this conflict very closely, and they're taking their cues. The idea that we will have more security if we abandon Ukraine strikes me as fanciful. It will tie us down there even more. It will introduce more chances and more opportunities for dictators across the world to seek out their advantages at our expense, and it will make us more tied, more tethered to European security, not less. The costs of this conflict and our support for it are very high, but the prospect of failure introduces the notions of the idea that we would have to commit even more resources, and those costs may in fact be unbearable.
You can keep them 7 minutes.
Sure.
Because
I don't know if I went over very well.
No, it's fine.
all right. I have 4 points to make. Let's see if I can get through all 4. I need to at least get through the first 3. I think they're important. If we back up just from Ukraine for a second, what we're really talking about at a macro level is something that you'll hear referred to as the liberal international order, or perhaps the rules-based international order. What do people mean when they say this? What they specifically mean, typically, is this set of institutions, constructs, mental constructs, but also actual institutions like the World Trade Organization, in embryo anyway, the United Nations, born specifically in 1944, NATO, established in 1949, that were built more or less during this 1945 to 1950 period as a response to a completely new world order that the world had not seen before, the so-called bipolar world order, and as a US response to the potential for Soviet aggression, which was what everyone feared at the time. Okay. Now, the LIO, we are told, is wonderful because it succeeded. It bound the transatlantic alliance together. It actually welcomed countries outside the transatlantic alliance into it. It upheld decades of peace and relative prosperity. It eventually won the Cold War. All right. And from this success, we are told, this is where I get a little skeptical, that everything great about the LIO, we just need to kind of double and triple down and keep all of it going, because what worked in one context works in another. But what we had in that 45 to 50 period, and then we could take this all the way to 1989 or 1992, whatever date you want to give for the end of the Cold War, was an extraordinary emergency that no longer pertains today, right? The Reagan quote was 1985. Let's think back to 1985 for a second. The Soviet Union was a lot more dangerous than whatever Russia can conceivably do to us today. And also 1985 is just 2 years after the most dangerous year of the Cold War, the most dangerous 3 months of the Cold War, September, October, November 1983, since the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. My only point here is that times have changed. I'm not here to condemn the liberal international order. I feel about it sort of the way I feel about the Republican Party. If it's coming to the end of its natural life, it deserves a dignified death. I'm not saying euthanize it, just let it pass out of the world. I'll go to the funeral. If I'm asked to speak, I'll say nice things about it. I won't get up at the podium and denounce it, but its time has sort of been here, and it's maybe time for it to go, if it is time for it to go. Second of all, I don't think it's in our interest, it was clearly in our interest to do what we did in the 45 to 50 period, and then in the decades thereafter. I don't think it's necessarily in the United States' interest to be as active in the world as we are today, or as those who run American foreign policy in both parties would like us to be, right? I think we have gotten overextended. We are gotten involved in places that are peripheral to US interests, overcommit in these places and underdeliver, and at a tremendous opportunity cost for things that really matter, both domestically and internationally. And third, I think even if you could convince me, hard to do, but maybe it's possible, I try to keep an open mind, that this all is in our interest, I don't think we're capable of doing it anyway, right? If you look at what's going on in the United States, right, we've got a lot of big time domestic problems. We got a lot of big time international problems. Look at what's going on just in the Navy right now. Right? Just last week, the Navy, I'm going to get the details wrong, so I'm sure since this will be live streamed, someone will correct it and say that I'm an idiot. That's fine, I accept it. I'm an idiot. But I know that one ship was dispatched to go to the Middle East, and before it got a couple hundred nautical miles, it had an engine room fire and had to turn around and go back. Right? And I don't mean to bash the Navy. I grew up around the Navy. I love the Navy. This is why I follow the Navy and pay attention to what's going on, is they've been not performing at the level that they should be. It's sort of like if you follow what's going on with, let's just say, pick one, Boeing, some of the other airlines, right? This is endemic to our society. And as our capabilities erode, we seem to have our appetite for intervening and doing stuff gets greater. So I think even if you could convince me or anyone or all of us, this is absolutely in our national interest. It's like saying, well, it's in our national interest to, for every 15-year-old boy to bench press 500 pounds. Okay, how are you going to get there? How are you going to put the muscle on all those kids to make them do it? We don't have a plan for that. In fact, our capabilities are degrading. They're not increasing. And if I have time, just to address Russia specifically, right? We can go into this at length, and I'm sure we will. The problem talking about this, and I've experienced this, so I know from firsthand experiences, if you say anything whatsoever that casts any doubt or just speculatively wonders about another possible interpretation of events, one will immediately be called a Putin stooge, a this or that or the other thing, in league with him, an authoritarian or whatever. It's very difficult to talk about because the climate of the intellectual climate, the rhetorical climate surrounding this issue is very, very, very clouded. There's no question Putin invaded Ukraine's sovereign territory in 2022, and he shouldn't have done that, and he should be blamed for it. There's no question about it. But if we're going to go backward, we can go back to 2014. We can go back further than Noah did, right? We can go back to promises allegedly given at the end of the Cold War. There's still some debate about this, what promises were actually made to Russia, what weren't. We can go back to the redrawing of the map during the Khrushchev era of the Soviet Union that included in the Ukraine SSR territories which had never been part of the historical conception of Ukraine going back to, you know, the 9th century AD. Now, I'm sure someone pro-Russia would say, Anton is repeating Putin's talking points. Well, you know, just because Putin said it doesn't mean all of it's wrong. Some of the points that he's bringing up are valid and actually historically accurate. Not every single one of them, but some of them are. But this leads me to sort of my most important point here is that what's going on over there, first of all, it's really complicated, and there's an 1100 or so year history between these two peoples, countries, civilizations, et cetera, that we Americans don't really understand. But we're asked to intervene and take a side as if it's cut and dried, and it's just obvious who's right and who's wrong, and where justice and morality lies, when I would submit to you humbly that the foreign policy establishment really doesn't fully understand what it's doing, or what it's gotten itself into, or what it's trying to get America further into. And finally, this may be the most controversial thing I'll say all night because it sounds callous, but I don't see a core US interest over there. I have sympathy for the Ukrainian people. I have sympathy for everyone who has suffered in this war, as I have sympathy for everybody who suffers pretty much in any war, right? It's terrible, it's awful. When you think about the scale of the destruction, it took the United States 10 years to lose 58,000 soldiers in Vietnam. I'm sure all of the casualty numbers that have come out of either Moscow or Kiev are fake in some way or another. But the low estimates on the Russian side, the low estimates are 100,000 dead in 2 years. On the Ukrainian side, it could be as high as 75,000, it could be less. It's harder, there's many more civilian casualties, obviously, on the Ukrainian side than there are on the Russian side. But the scale of this destruction is unbelievable, and I don't mean to minimize that or not have sympathy for it. But if sympathy is going to be the criteria, I mean, there's all kinds of conflicts, there's all kinds of struggles going on everywhere in the world. The United States should or should not intervene in these kinds of things based on a calculation of interest. And whether or not I don't believe there's a core United States interest at stake there. Okay, you can disagree with that, but here's a point that it's really hard to disagree with that I think is just axiomatic. Whatever our perceived interest there, the Russians perceive their interest there as about 10x, 100x, 1000x ours. And whenever you get in, that's just conceptually an asymmetric conflict, right? It's more important to them by a factor of a lot. They're much more willing to put a national effort into it than we are and stay the course. And it's always a mistake to take an adversary to the wall over something that adversary in particular thinks is a vital organ, absolutely core to his being, and that's peripheral to you. And that's what I think we're at risk of doing in Russia over Ukraine right now. And I think it's a mistake an elementary mistake of statecraft.
So I'm going to ask each of you to expand on something that you said during your remarks, just in order to flesh out your vision of US foreign policy, especially as it relates to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I want to begin by asking Noah, and I'll kind of combine the remarks that Noah made at the start of his comments with the point that Michael ended on. Noah, you pointed out that Russia has, it's a bad neighbor at the very least. It is a country which has, a history of bullying and, dominating any number of states around its borders. And the United States obviously finds that to be reprehensible behavior. Michael is questioning whether this is really in our national interest, however, to take a direct hand in stopping this. My question for you is, what is the U.S. national interest? Does the U.S. have a sort of general interest in being anti-imperialist towards any power in the world that may be aggressive, or is Russia some kind of special case?
I would say our foremost interest in supporting Ukraine's sovereignty and its desire to defend itself against aggression, not just being a bad neighbor, which I understand is, a euphemistic way of saying murdering people en masse, separating families, trucking off children into Russia to be re-educated. We shouldn't deny the moral case. Although I don't say that we should predicate American intervention on the moral case. Moral cases move stories which move armies. It's not something we should cede to our adversaries. Nevertheless, a very dispassionate, perfectly rational assessment of American national interests, I believe in this case, has everything to do with alliance structure. American alliance structure, especially the Atlantic Alliance, particularly robust, one of the most longest live defensive alliances in the history of the planet, and it serves our interests quite well. And the same logic that would sacrifice that conflict and that alliance structure can be applied anywhere else in the world. If we're going to say, well, Russia has a vastly more interest in subsuming Ukraine into the imperial structure, what does that say about China and Taiwan? Does that say about Israel, Egypt, and Jordan? I mean, you could say half a dozen other countries have a better interest in these countries in their neighborhoods just because they happen to have some proximity. That doesn't mean we have no interest there. We have a profound interest in preventing the establishment of inviolable spheres of influence, the sort of thing that existed pre-World War II that we don't want to see return, that would choke off waterways, that would make commerce more difficult, that would increase the necessity of our defense spending and increase the necessity of our support for our remaining allies. The alliance structure in Europe is applicable in the Pacific too, in part because we're talking about the same countries, France, England, the Dutch. These are our Pacific allies as much as they are European allies. And then we have a profound interest, not just in those that, naval powers in the Pacific, but also in states like Poland, for example, which is a profoundly valuable ally, not just in terms of its diplomatic and economic power. It's rapidly becoming one of the biggest economic powers in Europe, but its military power. There's some estimates that there's this 2% of GDP threshold that you're supposed to meet as a NATO ally, and quite a lot of the European powers do not meet them. But most of them on the periphery do, including Poland, which by some estimates underestimates the amount of GDP it contributes to defense because it doesn't want to scare everybody. It has really been putting a lot of energy and effort into creating a world-class military, not because it wants to make us happy, because it desperately fears the prospect of Russian domination. It's in our interests to support its independence, because its independence advances our interests in our broader alliance structure. And if we see that crumble in Europe, I don't know how that strengthens it in the Pacific or in the Middle East or elsewhere. Global hegemony means just that. Global hegemony, a challenge to American supremacy abroad, anywhere is a challenge to it everywhere. And yes, that makes people very uncomfortable who believe that American hegemony is not something that advances American interests. But I would challenge you and look at the history of this planet prior to 1991 and look at the prosperity and relative security that we have lived in since. And I would challenge you to explain to me why the status quo ante in the Cold War and the 20th century was better than what we've lived under in the last 25 years.
Well, that tees up very nicely the question I wanted to put to Michael, which is, you've talked about the demise of the liberal international order. Are you concerned about what's going to replace that order? Could it not be something far worse?
Of course it could, but we have to deal with the world as we find it. There's no going back to the heady days of, let's say, the 50s and 60s when America was an unquestioned, or even 1945. When America was the unquestioned global power, right? The Chinese are here to stay. I don't mean that just as a civilization, obviously, it's a multi-thousand-year-old civilization. I mean as a great power with a strong economy, with sophisticated technology, and a really powerful military. That fact alone makes it impossible for the United States to exert the hegemony that it used to exert and that many people today would like to see it continue to try to exert. Russia is obviously a completely different case, a far smaller country, far smaller economy. but the extent of territory, the oil and gas reserves, the cultural diplomatic influence over Eastern Slavs and all of the Orthodox who look to the Patriarch of Moscow, and just the nuclear arsenal alone, plus the alliance network. Alliance is maybe a little too generous a word, but the influence network it's managed to build over the last 20 years make Russia a force to be contended with that will prevent, and then the more these countries tie themselves together and cooperate with one another. I'll give you an example of how we have really screwed this up badly, I think. What the United States likes to do is use various levers within the so the liberal international order, part of the conceit of it all along was we're going to build these institutions and they're going to be neutral and they're going to treat everybody fairly so everybody can come in and you can trust them. And that used to be basically true. The United States didn't use its influence within these organizations to score political points in the moment. It used them in a kind of neutral way or led them in a kind of neutral way. They're like, these are umpires, you're going to get a fair deal. Well, lately, we've not been behaving that way. Just going back to some of the sanctions that we put on the Russians, but also excluding them from SWIFT, just one example. It's a banking organization that clears financial transactions, stuff like that, supposed to be administered neutrally. Well, the dream of Russia and China for the last 20 years at least has been, can we create something parallel to the American liberal international order? And they've had, or at least the financial order. And they've had trouble doing it because they can't find anybody who wants to be in their club, right? And they can't really find anybody who trusts them. But when other countries see us, my colleague, Christopher Caldwell put it this way, I'll get the quote wrong, but it'll be close enough. He said something like, the United States suddenly began using this power like a blind drunk, right, in 2022, in ways that it had not before. And it starts scaring other countries and driving them into the arms of this wished for would-be Russia or Moscow, Beijing axis to create a parallel order that would exclude the US and its allies, right? That's counterproductive. Why are we doing that, right? If we want to maintain the LIO for as long as possible, and I'm not predicting its imminent demise, all I said was if I got invited to the funeral, I would go. And if I was asked to speak, I'd say nice things. I do think it's decaying, but if you're going to keep it alive for as long as possible, you wouldn't behave the way that we're behaving, I don't think.
Well, that raises a good question for Noah. Does the American public have the will to sustain the liberal international order, especially after the experiences the country has had with Iraq and Afghanistan?
Well, I think they do. I do see the signs that there's something of a Vietnam syndrome accompanying anything that has to do with Iraq. You mention Iraq and you get a visceral reaction. But the notion that the American people don't have the wherewithal to follow through with America's commitments is, I think, in fact, a product, or at least contributed to, by the utter lack of confidence in the voting public that our political leaders have in us. They do trust us to endure and support conflicts for very long. They believe that we will do, as we have over the last 70 years, get tired and just kind of go home and give up on our allies and sacrifice them to the wolves at their door. We did it in Afghanistan, we did it in Vietnam, we did it to the Kurds. And it's a pretty reliable trait, but it has less to do, I think, with the voting public than it does with our leadership, which just doesn't have the stomach to make the case for the liberal international order, or even on a narrower scope, for just the tailored conflicts that we are supporting, not prosecuting, supporting abroad from individuals, countries and members of those states that want to defend themselves and aspire to join the liberal international order. Part of the problem that countries like Russia and North Korea and China and Iran are experiencing is that they're terrible countries. The model that they're presenting to the world is not one that a lot of nations aspire to. Part of the reason why they have to subsume these countries into it by force is because they experience a lot of resistance to that. They're not creating a model to which people want to join naturally. Our advantage is that the liberal democratic order is an ideal to which most of the planet still aspires to. That is a natural advantage that we can exploit and support. And just because the American public gets weary, and I think frankly less weary than their leaders do, is no reason to abandon the geopolitical mission to which the United States has been blessedly bequeathed as the leader of a free liberal democratic status quo that is the world over the better model just by virtue of the number of nations that aspire to membership in it.
So, Michael, Noah has pointed to the risks to our alliance structure that is posed by what's happening in Ukraine. That if Ukraine is defeated, this is going to, first of all, create conditions of instability in Europe itself. It's going to send a signal, perhaps, to the entire world that the liberal international order that we have created an alliance structure to defend is no longer something that we're willing to invest the resources in to save. Are you worried about what's going to happen to our alliance structures?
Less, because we pointedly did not make Ukraine an ally. And one of the reasons why we have this conflict now is the United States is on again, off again ambiguity. Are we, we're not going to formally offer you NATO membership, but we're going to constantly hint that it's coming around the corner soon. Russians would object. There have been times in the past when the United States, at least internally, you can find, I'm sure everybody's seen this, right? If not, look it up. You can find the current head of the CIA back when he was the number 3 at the State Department, Bill Burns, writing that the NATO membership for Ukraine is a red line in Moscow and we should stay away from it. It's it doesn't get us much and it only antagonizes them. And that's just been jammed down the memory hole. And you're supposed to forget that one of the most stalwart officials in the Biden administration right now once said a thing that is now only attributed to Putin stooges, right? So it doesn't make sense. I mean, I know that Noah's partly right. Some people will interpret it this way, but they shouldn't, right? If I make a commitment to you and I break it, okay, that's one thing. That should worry everybody else to whom I have made similar commitments. If I didn't make a commitment to you, then I didn't break anything. We don't have an alliance with Ukraine. We didn't admit Ukraine to NATO. You might argue that we should have. I would argue the opposite. We should not have. But it should be fairly clear to the core members of in our alliance structure, what the difference is.
I just want to say that Michael's absolutely right about that, and I would say that I'm going to commandeer it as a point for me, because it is absolutely true that we had a map ascension process for states like Georgia and Ukraine in 2005. It stalled out in Bucharest in 2008. They said, ascension is sort of a thing that you're going to do. You're going to get it eventually, but you got to work on this corruption internally. And until then, you're not going to ascend. It was stalled out virtually indefinitely. There really is a correlation there, I think, between the Bucharest summit in April of 2008 and the Georgia invasion in August of 2008. I think you can draw a pretty clear line there because of these mixed signals that we were sending these member states or aspiring member states, and by being wishy-washy on that, we have given green lights to our adversaries to say, okay, well, I have a window to act, and that window isn't going to be open very much longer.
So it sounds like your solution would be to say firmly that we're going to admit all these countries rapidly.
That meet the criteria, yes. And I'll give you one example of why that is successful. Montenegro, which ascended to NATO membership under the Trump administration, along with North Macedonia, which was subject to a Russian-led coup, violent coup, during the accession process. And afterwards, Russia backed off. Why? Because it does observe NATO as a threat. Now, it tests the boundaries. It's the big threat, the biggest concern I have is not that Russia will execute some sort of fold-the-gap style invasion of Russia, is that it will engineer a crisis in the Suwalski Gap or in Estonia that would compel NATO members to lean into Article 4 or even Article 5. And then we get are we going to die for Danzig debate? Do we really want to confront this nuclear power just for tiny Tallinn? At which point, the NATO membership functionally collapses. If the mutual security guarantees are not worth the paper they're written on, then neither is the alliance, and the Atlantic Alliance subsequently collapses. Whether it continues to exist or not, it's a paper tiger, and that's my biggest concern.
Well, I'm going to turn, just as you took mine and used it against me, I'm going to turn your point against you. The dumbest thing we can do, it seems to me, is to make formal promises that we know or ought to know we can't keep. I'm not going to name any names here because that'll just get me in even much more trouble. But I believe the United States has done that in certain parts of the world. We've said, all right, we will guarantee X or Y or Z. When you look at the capabilities arrayed on both sides of a potential crisis here, and everybody knows or should know, we can't do it. We can't. We would either try and fail, okay, or we would look at it when the crisis came, if the crisis came, and we would have to say, sorry, you're on your own. And then those consequences would follow. I agree with that. But who would really be at fault? I would say at least 50% of the blame, maybe 51% of the blame at a minimum would be on the people who made the promise in the first place, who should have done it.
Let's talk about that question of capabilities. So, Noah, do you see any risk of America being stretched too thin by investing very strongly right now in Ukraine, potentially having to invest as much or more in Taiwan if there's a conflict that breaks out there in the near future? There are any number of hotspots around the world, including the Middle East, of course, where U.S. resources are being called upon to be deployed. And it seems like that's a lot to do. And Michael has expressed some skepticism as to whether we have perhaps the arms, the industrial capability, the resources to meet all of these needs. Are you concerned about that, or do you think that we have the ability to rebuild these kinds of structures?
Well, yeah, I think the answer to your question is in the question itself. Yes, I am concerned about our resource deficiency, and the remedy to that is to build up our resources, to contribute to the defense industrial base, which is part of the reason why we have the legislation on the table that we're discussing right now, to rebuild the defense industrial base and provide, for example, Ukraine and Taiwan with the ordnance they need to defend themselves and defend ourselves. If we are struggling to provide our allies in Korea, Taiwan, Ukraine with artillery shells, what does that say about us? It's not like we won't need these things. It seems like that should be a blinking red light for us to commit to redevelop the defense industrial capacity. And by the way, just because we haven't appropriated these funds to right now doesn't mean the logic of the demand side of the economy isn't taking hold. Companies like Boeing and Lockheed are investing speculatively in the development of big facilities in order to meet the increasing demand by a deteriorating threat environment, as you would expect, on spec, because they fully expect to be remunerated by virtue of the fact that these conflicts are not going away, and they're right to do so. Likewise, the bill on that we're looking at now invests heavily in the submarine defense infrastructure. And we need that in part because 40% of our attack submarines right now are in dock. They're not in the field because boats are really difficult to maintain. Michael's right about our Navy preparedness. Navy preparedness is something that should keep everybody up at night. The delays in getting, for example, our new frigate classes into blue water is something that is very disheartening. But the answer to that is not to say, well, I guess we just can't do it. It's to do it.
Michael, you've become a supporter of industrial policy. Do you see support for Ukraine and other conflicts being something that can help rebuild America's defense industry?
No, not as far as I can see, because first of all, nearly all of what we physically given to Ukraine has simply come out of existing stocks, which have been drawn down badly and not replenished. Second of all, most of that stuff, the vast majority, have not been the kind of big ticket items that Noah's talking about, which have been excluded for political and other legal reasons, and for reasons of not wanting to appear to be or to actually be escalating the conflict. And I have not seen evidence of any sort of backfilling of, well, okay, we got to get our production lines up and running for this, that, and the other thing. In fact, what I see is the evidence of the opposite. Not only are we not doing that, we're not even remanufacturing the ordnance, artillery, drones, cruise missiles, rocket, those kinds of things at the clip that we would need to just to break even with where we were when all of this started back in February of 2002. I mean, it's one thing to say, and I agree with this, we should do it. Okay, we should do it. But for some reason, the United States doesn't seem capable of doing a lot of things right now. I mean, I can name 5 or 10 things off the top of my head the United States government ought to be doing that it isn't doing, either because it doesn't want to, it doesn't know how, it's politically tied in knots, whatever. But just saying we should do it doesn't get it done. As a matter of fact, it's not getting done right now. And these problems aren't getting better right now. They're getting worse. And until they do start to get better, it seems to me, I think we ought to be much more careful about husbanding our resources for a conflict if and when a conflict comes where a core national interest truly is at stake.
Well, Michael, would you vote if you were in Congress for the 3 separate, take the 4th one out, the 3 separate defense industrial base bills and the foreign aid bills?
Not unless I don't know. I'd have to look at them very, very, very carefully. You know the way these sort of legislation works.
Yeah.
You can vote yes or no on something, and what is it? The famous Nancy Pelosi line. Well, we have to pass the bill before we can see what's in it. I would actually want to see it before I voted on it.
That's fair.
In general, though, yes, I would. I'm not. I long ago shed my old conservative economic dogmatism about the United States having industrial policy, intervening, and like that. I wouldn't care about that I wouldn't be opposed on ideological grounds. I would just want to be able to see the details and make sure that it actually does what it's supposed to do and doesn't just shift a bunch of money over into places that get spent and no result comes out of it. I would worry about that because I think a lot of that happens in defense procurement.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. And I think we're in heated agreement about the necessity of rebuilding our defense industrial capacity, not just for our allies' sake, but for our own sake. But there is only one mechanism to do that, and that's through the Congress.
So you had raised the concern about escalation, Michael. Noah, do you think there's a risk of nuclear escalation in the United States continuing to support Ukraine? And it seems to me that if Russia starts suffering even worse in terms of its invasion and the failure to secure objectives, the more success the Ukrainians have, the more likely it is that the Russians will escalate even further. And the Russians have an escalatory spiral that leads all the way to nuclear weapons. Is that something that we should think about when we consider the strategic risks involved in the Ukraine conflict?
Of course, absolutely. We should think about it. We should observe it. The risk is not zero. However, I think the Biden administration in particular has been cowed by a conception of Russia's nuclear propaganda as being far more sincere than I think it is. Nuclear deterrence as a concept works both ways. The United States maintains a nuclear deterrent posture, and Moscow knows exactly what it is. They know exactly what our op plan is. Vladimir Putin knows our nuclear history, the PSYOPs in the 1970s, and the targeting strategy, which would target Moscow directly and the leadership directly. There was a very famous commentary article where I used to work by Daniel Pipes, 1977, which articulated the logic of the Soviet High Command at the time, insofar as they believed that they could win a nuclear conflict, which would consist of first strike targeting offensive weapons, and then relying on the concept of self-deterrence. So all our ICBMs are known where they are. We don't have road mobile missiles, right? We have ICBMs, 400 of them. They're in North Dakota. You hit them hard, they're gone. So if you were to mount a retaliatory strike, we would just hit your value targets. We'll just hit your cities. There's no point in you retaliating at all. At that point, you're self-deterred. That was the concept that was a live vision of how to win a nuclear war in the Soviet theory of nuclear war fighting in the 1970s. We've since adopted that doctrine to the point where the Russian leadership understands that there's no surviving a nuclear conflict. And we discount that inducement in ways that I don't quite understand why. It's a very powerful inducement. If you know that you will use if you use nuclear weapons, there's no surviving that. There's no outcome on the other side of that that advantages you. That is something that we should internalize when we're talking about deterring Russian aggression, nuclear aggression. The Biden administration, and Joe Biden in particular, is very scared of the prospect of a Russian first use, which I think is far more remote than this White House does. And it has cowed them to a degree that has not helped us, particularly in the fight in Ukraine. I think that's part of the reason why he's been the dribs and drabs strategy, where it was not going to give him tanks, so we'll give him tanks. Not going to give him cluster munitions, so we'll give him cluster munitions. Not going to give him long-range rockets, HIMARS, attack them, and then eventually they do, because they get over this thing that they talk themselves into, which is if we overly commit, the Russians might use a tactical nuclear weapon first. And they get close to realizing that that's fallacious, and then they pull back. And they get close and they pull back. But a full understanding of nuclear deterrence would understand that the American deterrent works just as well as the Russian deterrent.
I mean, there's a lot one could say about all of this. I think Noah is skipping to the end of the top rung of the escalation ladder, which is an all-out exchange between the two powers. You can never rule anything out, but that's the least likely outcome of what could happen here. What the Biden administration, what anybody who'd be looking at this has to worry about is something on a much more limited scale than that, but that's devastating enough that if it were to happen, everyone would regret it and be, trying to untangle answers for the next 50 or 100 years to figure out how it came to this. The same way people still read about July 1914 and haven't, and will be the most studied month until the end of time or something bigger happens to try to figure out precisely how to World War I start, right? I don't think it would go to an all-out nuclear exchange. I don't think that's necessarily what Putin thinks about. I think I agree that the risk of nuclear use by Putin right now is low, but that's because he thinks he's winning. And as far as I can tell, he is winning. He's paying a terribly high price for it. It's taken him a lot longer than he thought it would. It's cost him a lot more than he thought it would. But as long as he doesn't feel like he's losing, he's not going to go there. At least that's the estimate US planners have. The reason why they get worried about escalating, this is the problem that we face. The more we escalate or the more we give or the more we get involved or the more we encourage allies to get involved and so on, if it really were to turn the tide, I happen to believe that's basically impossible, absent some massive step from us I don't think we would contemplate, but let's say it were possible, right? And then Putin really starts to feel that he is losing, then our action will have upped the likelihood, by however much, that he might go to nukes if he feels that he might lose the war, his regime is at stake, or some core Russian interest were at stake. Now, it's then easy to say, oh, so you're saying, we shouldn't do the right thing because if he does X, it'll be our fault. Are you blaming America for? I'm not putting words in your mouth, but I do hear this from others all the time. You're blaming, well, no, but it's like, you got to think through the consequences of your action. The way I said this in an article that I published in the Claremont Review of Books, you should all subscribe, by the way. I get a little cut for everyone that if you put in the little code that says you're at this event, it's like a 50 cents or so per subscription, so keep me in mind. I said, this is like going into an ethnic neighborhood and shouting slurs, and then you get beat up. And you say, well, but I have free speech. Well, you do have free speech, but you also did something really stupid. You went into an ethnic neighborhood and you shouted slurs about the people who live in that neighborhood, and somebody beat you up. You kind of had it coming in that respect, or at least consequence followed action. You're not blameless in this, right? People want to be able to say, well, whatever we do the right thing, and then this bad action is on that guy over there, and I bear no responsibility for it. But if the bad action is nuclear use or a nuclear exchange, well, I don't know. I kind of think we ought to be looking at causality all the way around. And the last thing I would say on this point, another thing that deters Putin on this is nobody wants to go first with nuke, right? The last time a nuclear weapon was used, at least in a hostility, not in a test, was August 9th, 1945, right? Whenever it happens again, whoever does it is going to get opprobrium for a century, easily. Even if they were totally or they can make a great case for why they were in the right. It was necessary. They had to survive it. And everybody who's ever contemplated this or has ever done any of that kind of Rand Corporation game theory thinking about it knows this from square one, start one. If you go first on one level, you lost, right? Even if you save some, everything else. And by the way, no one's going to accept or half the world is not going to accept your explanation that you were justified in doing this and you would have been ruined had you not done it, and so it was excusable. That thought alone probably deters Putin at least as much as anything else that might follow on from it.
So Noah, you said in your remarks at the beginning that America should think at least as much about Russia and its aims as about what victory would look like for Ukraine. Michael, however, has just said that he thinks that in terms of conventional support we give Ukraine, no amount of support is going to suffice to secure victory for Ukraine. So my question for you is, what does victory for Ukraine look like? And is it a goal that can be obtained by what kind of support would we have to give them in order to obtain victory?
This is a question that I don't know if I have a satisfactory answer to, because I am not close enough to the ground at a tactical level to be able to tell you how to get to XYZ. I know what Kyiv says it wants. Kyiv says it wants the 1991 borders. I know what Moscow is acting like it wants. Moscow is acting like it wants the 1989 borders. This seems to be the impasse at which we're at. It's incumbent on us not to define the terms of victory for Kyiv. It's incumbent on us to support Kyiv in its effort to resist a naked attempt to subsume this country into a federation that it does not want to be a part in, to erase the culture of Moscow in a war that it started nakedly and aggressively without a casus belli. That's it. That's really where I'm coming from. And I don't think that the same logic applies. Michael's absolutely right. The opprobrium that would be heaped on the country that used nukes for the first time since 1945 would be positively unendurable. The only countries I could see Looking past that would be the anti-American axis that's forming around Russia, the Chinese, your Iranians, and the constellation of terrorist networks that orbit around these organizations. But the same applies conventionally. This is a conventional war of conquest to erase the dignity and the humanity of the Ukrainians. Their sin is to say, hey, you want to help us out here? That's the extent of their offense that they have caused that seems to have so rankled their critics in the West, and I just don't see it. A conventional war of conquest is as odious as the use of nuclear weapons as a deterrent.
Michael, what does the end of the war look like for you? So it seems as if you're saying that regardless of how much support we give them or don't give them.
Not regardless. I mean, if the United States wanted to, and a coalition of allies wanted to commit major ground forces, that could turn the tide, at least for a time. But then the Russians would have to go all in, and you could see that going nuclear quickly. I'm thinking my operating assumption is that we are not contemplating that and would not contemplate that. I do believe, based on what I have read, that the power imbalance between Russia and Ukraine is so great, population, economy, resources, military technology, military capabilities, size of army, and so on, that simply pouring ordnance and equipment, and even if we were to up the equipment, better tanks, more fighters, this kind of thing, jets, and so on and so forth, but without actual NATO forces going in and fighting, I don't think that any amount we could do on that level can correct that power imbalance. It can keep the war going on for a long, long time, but I don't see I mean, that's a pretty terrible thing for the people in that region, and I don't see how it helps our interests.
The Ukrainians want to fight. We do have a profound technological advantage. One of the reasons why Ukraine is losing now is they have to triage ordnance, and Russia is winning in part, on the ground, in part because they're conducting what are quote unquote called meat wave assaults, and they're exactly what they sound like. Very Stalinist approach to gaining ground, throwing men at these overwhelmed defenders who just don't have enough bullets and ammunition to defend themselves. That is a target-rich environment for a properly equipped force.
Well, here's another thing about this, this is unpopular, but it needs to be said, I think. I think Noah is presuming a level of Ukrainian unity that doesn't exist. And this gets back to something I said very early on. It's a complicated situation that's been about 1,100 years in the making that Americans don't really understand. I don't pretend to understand it. I didn't study Russian history. I've read some books. I've been in government. I had to read a lot of documents. So I have some rudimentary understanding, but it's a divided country. It's not a 50-50 country necessarily, but there are large numbers of people who speak Ukrainian, identify as Ukrainian, and look west, want to be part of the EU, want to be part of NATO. But there is a non-trivial portion of the population of this country. It's a third, it's maybe 2/5, but non-trivial. It's not 5%. Okay, and in some areas, it's 80-90% that speak Russian, that look to Moscow, that look to the patriarch of Moscow, that think of themselves as sort of, if not Russian, as quasi-Russian or brothers with the Russians. So it's not like Russia, there's this wholly separate country with a completely separate culture and a totally different language over here, and Russia just went in against the wishes of everybody. Why has Russia been able to operate in the Donbass as effectively as it has? Not saying morally, just effectively as it has since 2014, because it's got a lot of support in there. Why was it able to take Crimea basically bloodlessly and then win a referendum? Okay, maybe he cheated to a certain extent on the referendum, but it's been quiet. That was 2014. It's 8 years. No, golly, I lose track of time. It's a decade later. There's no insurgency going on in Crimea, right? It's because this is part of the old Russian heartland part of Ukraine, right? And when we get involved in stuff like this, we don't really know who's who and what's what. I mean, there are American experts. You could find them into some desk in the State Department or in the intelligence community, and they could tell you all of this. But most of the people, even the so-called experts, and especially the people at the top of the pyramid pulling the levers and making policy, they don't really understand this.
I just think that was far more true in the last decade than it has been in this decade. Roughly, we have polling, public polling of this country, where I've been and to whom I speak to, and I don't see this disunity in the polling, nor do I see it in the religious culture. There's this breakaway Ukrainian church that's a Ukrainian Orthodox church, the Russian Patriarch, the Russian Orthodox Church, to which they would presumably the Russian-leaning Ukrainians would aspire. Only 14%, according to polling, are members of the Russian Orthodox Church as opposed to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. The cultural distinctions there that were very visible in the early 2000s and the 1990s between the Russian side and the Ukrainian side, very distinct. They've been erased over the course of the last decade of warfare by Russian aggression.
I don't know about erased. I
Not
mean,
erased,
you've
but
been there, I haven't been there.
significantly mute.
All I can tell you is what I've read and people I've talked to, and I
The
don't
Russian
think the
war
country-
has created
I
a
don't
sense
think the
of
country is half Russian, but I also don't think it's 95% Ukrainian identified. Ukrainian.
I couldn't put a
Ukrainian.
number on it. That's true. But the Russian war has created a sense of nationalism and nationality among Ukrainians that, while there prior, was not nearly as pronounced as it is. One of the interesting phenomenon that has backfired so profoundly on Moscow is that its invasion has created the sense of Ukrainian nationhood that was far more nascent before this war.
Well, you asked about the end for me. I mean, look, let's just begin from one premise. Since there is no physical way, short of a conflict with Russia, that we either can't win or that would go nuclear, to go back to the 1991 borders, can we begin from the premise that we're not going back to the 1991 borders? So the border is going to look different somehow. It doesn't have to look like, it's not going to be the reincorporation of a Ukrainian SSR with a viceroy from Moscow sitting in Kiev, okay? But it's going to look something different. There are parts of the country that in a settlement will either go back to Russia and be formally part of Russia and or be recognized something along the lines of the Minsk Accords, where they're part of sovereign Ukrainian territory, but all these minority rights are respected and the Russians have certain ability to monitor things in there, to look after people that they consider to be their friends and allies who look in their direction. It's actually not that difficult to think through what a settlement might look like. The problem is talking about it, because as soon as you say any of these things, you're admitting that aggression will be, you'll be accused of admitting that, well, aggression will be rewarded. Well, I mean, almost any peace settlement, to some degree, anytime a map is changed, you can make that argument. So, well, and the outcome of every war for justice to be prevailed is status quo ante. Well, if the status quo ante is simply not possible because of the power imbalance and the facts on the ground, then what do? I don't think sticking to a point and saying that it's moral and then everybody else who won't stick to that point is a bad person who's excusing aggression is the answer. It'll keep the conflict going for a while to, as far as I can tell, well, maybe not nobody's benefit, but to very few people's benefit.
So, Michael, 2 points that Noah brought up, which I think are worth your addressing. First of all, that you do have a heightened sense of Ukrainian nationalism as a result of the conflict. Also, that a number of America's allies in Eastern Europe, Poland and others, are also deeply invested morally in this conflict. So my question for you is, if the scenario you've envisioned comes to pass, that there is an armistice or some agreement that leads to a cessation of immediate hostilities, but you've had a Ukraine which has been deprived of Crimea, the Donbass, perhaps other territories as well, wouldn't the rump, basically, of Ukraine be very strongly anti-Russian, very strongly aligned with many of America's Eastern European allies? And wouldn't there be a very powerful pressure to admit that Ukraine to NATO?
There might be, but I don't see how you could make that a settlement. How do I put this? I don't mind getting it. I'm like Sam Spade in the Maltese Falcon. I don't mind a reasonable amount of trouble, but I have to limit the amount of trouble I get myself in. So sometimes I have to pause and look at the ceiling and think carefully about exactly how I word something. I don't see how you get the Russians to sign on any Russian. It doesn't have to be Putin. Putin could drop dead tomorrow, and whoever the new czarlet they replace him with would feel the same way. I don't see how you get them to sign on a dotted line without a pledge that there's no NATO accession for Ukraine. Or you could lie to them and make the pledge and then do it later anyway. That's probably not a great idea either. So you're right, we will have a big problem with Poland. We won't really have much of a problem with Hungary, though. And I don't think the Eastern European situation will be as bad as you think. The Poles will be extremely angry for reasons, I mean, listen, I don't hold that against the Poles, let me put it that way. If you were Polish and you had to deal with the Russians the way you've dealt with them for the past 400 years, you wouldn't be particularly Russophilic either. The Germans would be very, very upset, but more for sort of less direct reasons or less kind of feeling it in their heart than a kind of abstract. This violates the 1945 consensus. I think that the Italians and the French and the British would make a lot of noise, but at the end of the day, it would just be sound and fury, and they would quiet down fairly quickly, because I don't think that they, at some level, they realize this isn't a core interest, and that the war, that what the West has been trying to do over the last 2 years has failed, or at least hasn't succeeded, and it's better to get it over with.
So we're going to turn to audience question and answers in just a moment. So as you think about questions, let me go back to Noah for a moment and ask him about something that Michael said just a few minutes ago. If it does turn out to be the case that something more than supplying tanks and aircraft, but actual boots on the ground from NATO are necessary in order to win the war for Ukraine, is that something you would support?
No, and it's one of my fears is that we get removed from that equation, in part because we convince ourselves of the fiction, for example, that we have some capacity to arbitrate a bifurcation of the country. We don't. It's not in our capacity to do so. If we were to overstretch in that sense, diplomatically overstretch our bounds, it would weaken the alliance. If we were to allow Ukraine to descend into some sort of a status of a failed state with an insurgency on the doorstep of the NATO frontier, it would weaken the alliance. It would create all these inducements among our partners, some of whom are speculating openly about the need to introduce troops, not in a combat capacity, right? If you're Macron, Emmanuel Macron was actually just speculating on this very publicly and got wrapped on the wrists pretty hard by the NATO alliances, by saying, look, we should probably put some troops in here, right? But that was a warning sign to me. That was a source of profound disquiet for me, because it demonstrates the challenge before Joe Biden. It's not just keeping the Russians contained insofar as they can be contained in the parts of Ukraine they currently occupy and rolling them back, hopefully. It's keeping the alliance together. It's keeping the alliance from freelancing its way into something we don't want, stumbling its way into a conflict, overstretching, and ending up in a conflagration as a result. Balancing these 31 powers is its own full-time job, let alone keeping that conflict contained. So to answer your question, no, don't support it. Don't think it's necessary, frankly. If we were to provide the material and financial resources, but material mostly, I don't think that it would be a necessary contingency. And I fear not doing so makes that more likely, not less.
So let's take some questions from the audience. Now, Tom has a roving microphone. So let me call on you, make sure your question is a question, and then we'll proceed from there. We'll take the gentleman there in the middle there in a sports jacket.
I promise it's a question. What is the limit of what we give up? Looking at historically, a lot of things, Korea, the Korean invasion, the Sudetenland going back further, Kuwait, where the dictators make the miscalculation about when we are willing to stop. So regardless of Taiwan, if Ukraine is required to surrender, give in, give up, whatever it is, what's next? Moldova, the Baltic states, where do you think that would stop?
I mean, if you're asking where I think the Russians would go, I honestly don't think they would go anywhere. Now, that could be proved out, and I could be proved a fool, and they'll go to Warsaw or whatever. I just don't believe that that's actually an appetite, or it may be in some kind of grand, half a bottle of vodka in and thinking big, but nobody's really thinking about it as a kind of realistic prospect. And I think even if they tried, they wouldn't get anywhere. I mean, look at how much trouble they've had against a much weaker country, much weaker civic institutions, much weaker military, and that's on their border with these close cultural ties and so on. Like, if we maybe have a dispute here about how quite united or nationalistic Ukraine is. We don't have a dispute about Poland. Poland it wouldn't even be 99-1. It would be 100-0. Stop the Russians, and I don't think they could deal. And then you actually have the crossing the Article 5 threshold. So I just don't, that's not something that keeps me up at night.
I'm a little less sanguine about it. I think that if Moscow had its druthers, it would drive to Odessa. It would ignite a conflict in Transnistria, which is this the separate breakaway portion of Moldova, with the design of destabilizing and eventually subsuming Moldova into something resembling the Imperial Soviet Compact. And then it would turn its eyes on the Suwalski corridor, which separates Kaliningrad from Belarus and cut off the Baltic states.
Let's take more questions. I see one there. Yes.
It's another question for Michael. You noted that American aggression with sanctions and SWIFT pushed, you said, countries towards the Russian fold. How do you reconcile that with Sweden and Finland ascending to NATO and the recent protests in Georgia?
Well, they're just two separate issues. I mean, Sweden and Finland are European countries that have been, that stayed out of NATO for historical reasons, but that have genuine historical and present reasons to fear Russia. What I'm more worried about is, the country I'm most worried about is India, okay, which is not going to be involved in this in any way except peripherally. Although you note that India, whom the United States has been working to cultivate as an ally, or at least a sort of proto-ally for a long time, has been more than cool toward Western assistance to Ukraine and basically unwilling to criticize Russia and even occasionally say friendly things toward Russia. What I'm especially worried about, and we're only seeing the first baby steps here, and maybe it won't go anywhere, and maybe we'll fix it. But right now, I'm worried about it. Russia and China alone trying to create the next reserve currency probably aren't going to make it happen. They're not going to create the entire web of, forget the liberal international order, just the financial tools like SWIFT and others. But all of a sudden, you add India to that mix, a country that big, that many people, that big an economy, a serious military, and a dominant power, it starts to look a lot different. Now, there's a lot to overcome there. India and China have their own problems that they're going to need to work out, and I don't think those are going to be easy or quick to work out. But it's just, it's something that worries me, and it's other countries, sort of more in Asia or in other parts of the world than in Europe, that I think we are at risk of dropping out of our system, or at least of joining both clubs at once for a while and seeing how the waters are. And the more, if it works out that these guys are treating me a little bit better than the Americans, or they're less moralistic and hectoring about it, well, maybe I'll put more of my business over here. I mean, we used to be able to completely take for granted that every oil transaction every day was traded in US dollars. It's happening less and less. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but the share of oil being traded under US dollars is going down, down, down by the day. And this is something that China, and particularly Russia, China as consumer, Russia as a producer, have desired for years. Get the oil market off US dollars. We're finally starting to see that because other countries are willing to deal in other currencies and they hadn't been used to before.
No,
that's to escape us. That's to escape. One reason is to escape the potential leverage that we have over them, over things that they consider to be none of our business.
What's your thought of that scenario, Noah?
I think it's 100% right. Not only is that happening and it's a concern, but the concerns that Michael raises are absolutely correct. It doesn't seem to me a rationale for shrinking from the world stage. It seems to me a rationale for engaging with it more directly. But the threat that Michael outlines is 100% true.
So we had a question from the gentleman in a beard right there. Yes.
Yeah. My question is for Noah Rothman. And before I ask it, I just want to say that I find it incredibly appropriate that the question I am about to ask, I am asking it essentially in the shadow of the LBJ Presidential Library. But you've been going throughout this entire presentation talking about if we don't stop Putin in Ukraine, he's going to go on and he's going to go after country X, country Y, country Z. And how is what you're saying right now any different from the domino theory that Johnson tried to sell us on during Vietnam?
Well, it's different insofar as we're not talking about an ideological struggle, although the domino theory gets a lot of bad rap because in Cambodia fell and Laos fell. And everybody says, well, the domino theory didn't work out just because Thailand didn't fall. Well, okay, I guess you can leave that where it is. But we're not talking about an ideological conflict or an insurgency or an internationally funded, something directed from Moscow with no fingerprints on it. We're talking about a sovereign country's military and its regime claiming this territory as its own. The parallel is not Indochina or Southeast Asia. The parallel is World War II. The parallel is half a dozen other conflicts over the course of the 20th century where one nation decided that its neighbor's territory should be its own. I mean, frankly, one of the false rationale for communist insurgencies over the course of the 20th century was that they were wars for liberation. They were the fundamental expression of the populace throwing off the imperial yoke that they had been yoked with by international capitalism or what have you. This is fundamentally an imperialist war with imperialist aims, laid out flat. I mean, no one's even denying them. Neither combatant in this conflict says anything other than This is obviously an imperialist war. Moscow says that this country isn't even a country. It's just this strange little breakaway province that needs to be reined in. So the parallel I don't think necessarily applies.
Well, I might just say one thing. This is an anecdote. It's hearsay. I wasn't present for this, but I was told about it, and it might amuse you. I just offer it for the amusement factor. I make no claim to its validity or whatever. So a friend of mine says 20, 30 years ago, I forgot when, he's at a lunch with Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. And this is the founder and later, I suppose we may call him the leader or the dictator of Singapore. And he says that Lee Kuan Yew astonished the gathering by saying, you know, America won the Vietnam War. All these people are like, what are you talking about? But this guy's a genius, so maybe we should hear him out. He says, oh yeah, America won the Vietnam, like you lost, but you won. You showed a willingness to fight, you showed a willingness to maintain your commitments, and you made it really expensive to do what they did. And had you given up, I wouldn't be here right now. Singapore would be a communist country, the whole of the Southeast, not just Southeast Asia, but then you got to start thinking about Malaysia, Indonesia, and the islands. They would have just rolled the rest of it. And they walked away not knowing quite what to make of that. I still don't know what to make of it. But when somebody of that, you know, you can't, whatever you want to say about Lee Kuan Yew and his, let us say, lack of commitment to liberal democratic norms, we would have to admit, I think, that he knew something about the geostrategic position of Southeast Asia.
I did not expect to be rehabilitating Johnson's reputation in foreign policy here, but we're united.
Does that apply, though, Michael, to the Ukraine situation, where, you know, even if the aid we give Ukraine is not sufficient for however victory is defined for Ukraine, nevertheless, the willingness to support Ukraine is important in preventing this sense that there's no resistance to Russian aggression?
You know, if that's true, I think maybe the demonstration has been made. Because what's the outcome that you wanted in the Vietnam War? The United States did not even attempt to repeat the Korea mistake. That is to say, oh, look, the North Korean army is rolled up, so let's see if we can reunite the country with a Chinese border, right? Which Moscow and Beijing both said, no, we're not letting that happen. We said we're going to make the war aim what should have been from the beginning, just status quo ante, an independent South, an independent anti-communist South, right, that can maintain itself. It never tried to do more than that. What exactly are we trying to do in Ukraine? Are we, you know, we want to go back to what borders? Ukraine hasn't fully controlled the Donbass or Crimea since 2014. Can we at least go back to 2014? Our war aims are actually more expansive. So I don't see the analogy as exact either. I think if the United States could, and it won't, at least under the present administration, there's no way it will do this because not a single person will volunteer to even say this in an internal meeting, much less in public, right? But if the United States, under some dispensation, could bring itself to sit down at the table and negotiate some kind of settlement where Ukraine's got to give something up, the Russians have got to give something up, the whole thing is, then maybe that outcome could be. But what we're going to continue to go for is, you know, time machine back to 1991, maximalist demands. We get everything we want, you get nothing you want, and as long as that's our negotiating position, no one will negotiate with us. And since I don't think that can be achieved on the ground by military force, then we just have this grinding conflict that goes on and nobody benefits.
So we have time for a couple more questions. I see Rob Coons has one down here in the front.
I'll try it. I guess this question is for Rothman. Assuming that China is our greatest threat and the worst case scenario for US is a Russia-China alliance, I mean, suppose we could make a deal with Russia where we'd say, okay, Eastern Ukraine, we'll throw in Moldova, parts of Estonia, but in exchange for that, you break up the alliance with China. You become an adversary with China. Would you accept such a deal? And if not, why not?
I just think it's fanciful for a variety of reasons. One, it is not our place or in our capacity to sacrifice the sovereignty of these states. It's, again, a weird form of hubris and chauvinism to think that it's in our capacity to do so. These are human beings with agency and national sovereignty and ambition, and we don't have control over their destinies. Likewise, we can make all the deals we want with Putin's Russia. They ain't worth the paper they're written on. And the notion that Moscow would sacrifice its relationship with its foremost purchaser of its oil right now, for what? What could we offer them? The notion here that we could offer what they want is prestige. What Putin wants is a restoration of the prestige that Moscow had in the Soviet Union. He sees history and terms in far less material ways than I think we do in the West. There's something very tangible about national prestige to the Kremlin under Vladimir Putin. I don't think whatever deal he would make to us would be anything other than flattery. It would gull us into the notion that we had somehow disarmed this threat when we'd merely given it breathing space to reconstitute itself.
Well, look, the flip side to what you said, right, which is who are we to sacrifice as other countries? I agree with that, but it's very abstract. Concrete is who are we and do we have the capability to save all these countries, to protect all these countries, right? If we are faced with in a negotiating posture or some kind of relationship with a great power that has the power to do X and Y and Z to country A, okay, and we don't really have the power to save country A except at an enormous expenditure of national strength that may still fail and lead to escalation beyond anything we contemplate, well, the moral case suddenly seems less compelling. This is part of it. I teach classes on this to undergraduate students and to graduate students. And I try to explain to them that, look, the unsettling thing about foreign policies one unsettling thing about foreign policies, there's always going to be bad actors doing bad things, but it's never easy to resolve any of these questions simply on the moral basis. You have to be kind of hard-headed and think in terms of calculations of interests and also just least bad, right? And we tend not to want to do that. So I would be, look, another point to make here just about what you said. I agree. He needs, China is his biggest consumer and so on and so forth. But there are all kinds of, we don't have to go into them now, it'd take too long, but there are all kinds of natural fault lines or cleavages between Russia and China that the present state of the world and the behavior of the United States and the West are not tapping those fault lines to widen them, we're closing them. I don't think we're doing it on purpose, but inadvertently. So they've got a lot of reasons to want to be together. They've got a lot of reasons to want to be apart. They've got 1,000 years of history together, not all of it pleasant, a lot of it acrimonious. There are nasty things going on right now that they both pretend aren't happening so that they can present a united front to the world. But we would have actually, I think, a lot of opportunity if we were to pursue that route. But you can't pursue that route. It just can't be spoken, because if you say it, then you're rewarding aggression and you're a Putin stooge and you're in the pocket of Putin, and you probably support Putin electing Trump in 2016 via Facebook ads, and that's the worst thing that ever happened or something.
I just want to say that it is absolutely 100% true that there must be a limiting principle. Because every country on the planet coming to you and saying, save us, because there are bad actors on the planet, would be not a strategic approach to things. But I do believe that we do have concrete interests and material concerns that can be met. And the notion here that our alliance structure in Europe and 2% of our military budget, which is what is on the line and what we're contributing to Ukraine, is hardly an expenditure that we can't afford unless you believe the United States is a spent force, that it is morally bereft, that it cannot provide for itself, much less its interests abroad. And I don't believe that, and I think we should challenge those who believe that, or won't say it as much, but act as though we are a country that should be introverted, inward-looking, retreat and retrench from abroad, to explain why they believe this country's best days are behind it.
I think we're in a lot worse shape than you do. I think we do disagree about that.
And I would challenge you to explain why 2% is too much for us,
We'll,
why we can't maintain the alliance structure we have.
I think we'll get into this with the closing remarks in just a moment. We have one last question in the back there, and let's take that quickly before we do the closes.
Thank you. It's a quick question and a follow-up to Michael's comment about the settlement. So what would Zelensky have to do to save face and sit down and accept such an outcome? Because he's been making this personal commitments, right? It's become a personal thing for him to not relent, to not allow that settlement to happen. So what would you counsel?
You would have to relent. I mean, you would have to, I mean, if there's an inner conviction, you can always find the words. Let me put it that way. I was going to quote one of my favorite passages from Livy, but I won't do that. That's too pedantic even for me right now. But like, if he actually had a change of heart and said, all right, I got to make a deal. And then his next thought was, wow, but I've said these things over the past 2 years that make it really hard. I'm going to look like a fool, like I'm totally reversing myself. Well, stage 3 is, since I've already decided that I need to make a deal, I'll find some way to spin it. I'll find some way to explain it. So the only question is the inner conviction there, or is it likely to emerge? I have no idea. I can't look into the man's soul, to coin a phrase that's not entirely inapt to this context. But he's not talking like that right now, I can tell you that.
I would just say that politics happens in Ukraine too, and if he were to sacrifice more than the public would accept, that the government would collapse. Because Ukraine is a democracy, and it is beholden to the voters. And the government has fallen before and been replaced with this. The Poroshenko government prosecuted the war against Russia in Donbass and Crimea, and the Zelensky government was elected on a platform of appealing to Moscow. You know, Russia hawks like me were looking at Zelensky's candidacy and saying, ugh, this guy really wants to open up a dialogue with Moscow. He said the Poroshenko government was too hostile, too confrontational. Turns out we all had that wrong.
Alternatively, and I have no idea the likelihood of this because I haven't looked at any polling on it, but it's not inconceivable that at some point the Ukrainian people could do the reverse and say, okay, it's been 2.5 years of this or whatever, and we've lost X 100,000, and you look at the destroyed buildings and this, and the other thing, and actually we want a peace deal, and if you won't give it to us, we're going to vote you out and vote in this guy over here, whoever that is.
So on that note, we'll go to closing remarks, and we'll begin with Noah.
Well, I think it's been a very productive conversation, actually. Once again, I want to thank you, Dan. I want to thank you, Michael. Thank ISI and Civitas. I don't have much more to add to save something that Michael has said on a couple of occasions now, that people who adopt the posture that he's articulating his support for, which I think has been very productive today, they get calumny, they get attacked, they get called Putin stooges or what have you. And I don't support that at all. I think that's aggressive rhetoric, but it works both ways. You get people who adopt my posture, and we're bloodthirsty warmongers, evil neocons, the type that want to sacrifice your children to a conflict abroad that has absolutely nothing to do with American interests. Indeed, whose interests are you serving? I mean, we get that stuff all the time, and it's trash. It's nonsense. It's the sort of thing you need to brush off, because what we're talking about here is the defense of American interests as we see it, as we define them through debate, through the political process, and through our elected representatives. What I suspect is going to happen in Congress is I suspect these bills will pass, and I suspect they will pass broadly, which will be reflective of, as the founders defined it, the national will and the national consensus. And it's incumbent on the president, who will sign these bills into law and then prosecute what the Congress has given him the authority to do, to explain to the country why it is not a spent force, why these countries look to the United States for guidance and leadership and aspire to the model it projects into the world, and why that is superior to its competitors. And we have competitors. We have alternative theories of social organization right now that want to topple our own and replace it. And it hasn't been as vivid a contrast as we've seen since the 20th century, since the Cold War. And I think it's very much incumbent on this president, and I hope he will rise to the challenge. I don't think he will, but I hope he does, or his successor does, to explain why the aspirations of the Ukrainian people to live free, to have their own culture and identity, and to one day join the community of nations within the liberal order that has brought the kind of peace and prosperity we have not known previously. This is atypical. It's a garden. It takes maintenance. And it's the sort of thing we have to commit to defend and cultivate ourselves, lest we sacrifice it for our children.
The United States is not a spent force, and if it ever becomes one, it's going to take a while, because the amount of accumulated capital in every sense of that word is so high that we could muddle on like this for another 100 years or longer, or maybe less. I don't know, but it's not going to blow itself out tomorrow. I do think, though, that its eyes have gotten too big for its stomach. Its appetite for the things it wants to intervene in, that it wants to support, or at least our foreign policy elites want to do, is greater than the United States' present capability to do them, in terms of simple resources and raw strength, but also just in terms of core competence. We're just not as good at this stuff as we used to be, and it is showing. We are fraying. And I don't say this, I'd love to be wrong. I certainly don't say this with like joy in my heart, but you just open your eyes and look around, and you can see evidence of it all around you. Just stick only to the foreign policy realm or the military realm, and you see it. And it should not be that as our ability declines, our willingness or eagerness to do stuff increases, right? I think we ought to kind of hit pause on the ability or on the willingness to do stuff while we rebuild our capabilities, and then have a serious conversation about what truly counts as a national interest. No doubt, Noah and I define those differently. He defines them more broadly than I do. I define them more narrowly. But let's make one thing very, very clear. I appreciate that he didn't use this word. I was sort of bracing for it, but I never heard it. The United States is not now and has never been an isolationist country, and it never will be an isolationist country. But too much of what one hears, at least I hear all the time, is that word gets thrown around a lot. And usually when somebody says it, all they mean is, well, they mean maybe two things. Oh, I want to do X and you don't, you're an isolationist. And the second thing they mean is, I don't like you. Now, the United States is, as I said, has never been, even if you read, the statement of American foreign policy, portions of it, the 9 paragraphs in George Washington's farewell address that address foreign policy, right? This is where you get people think avoid foreign entangling alliances. That's actually in Jefferson's first inaugural, but whatever. I teach at Hillsdale College, so we learn these things. It has never been, even at its most constrained vision of how it ought to operate in the world, the United States has always wanted contacts, maintain commercial relations, keep shipping lanes open, right? Wanted to have diplomatic commerce and economic commerce with the world. So the question isn't one of turning inward or burying our heads in the sand. The question is, how expansively do you define the national interest? And to end where I began, I think it made sense, or at least a very strong argument can be made, that the great expansion in the conception of the national interest that took over American foreign policy in the 1945 to 50 period, and then sustained or guided American foreign policy through the Cold War, was reasonable and justified. I question whether that expansive conception is still justified in a post-Cold War world that's so different in every way, where our relative power, not absolute necessarily, but certainly our relative power relative to other great powers, including China, has declined, and where there are all kinds of things going on in the world that I don't see as core to US interests. And so in a way, the foreign policy that I'm arguing for is that period, the LI, the creation of the liberal international order, the Cold War, is the anomaly in the history of American foreign policy. The normal way, the default state, the way the founders said we ought to behave, and the way we traditionally did behave, and I think the way that it makes the most sense for us to behave, is not defined by that weird, strange interregnum. It's defined by the 150 plus years that came before, and it's being redefined now. We'll see where this comes out, right? I think Noah's completely right. I expect all of these bills to pass. I expect most people who vote for them, 99%, maybe 100%, will not read them or know what's in them. Thank you, Speaker Pelosi, right? But that's because the consensus in favor of this kind of LIO forever approach is overwhelming in both political parties and in the foreign policy establishment. I do think, here's where another place we disagree. I do think it's losing currency with the American people. I think they're rightly upset and dissatisfied by what they saw in 20 years of conflict following 9/11 and the failures and the high cost of those failures. And they're very skeptical, and they're wondering why, with an effectively all of these massive domestic problems that they have that are plaguing the country, they're wondering why, when Mitch McConnell goes out there and says more aid to Ukraine is the #1 priority for Republicans right now. What the Republican base heard is, my grocery bill's just doubled, the southern border is open, there's drug cartels operating down the street, there's a lot of stuff going on right here that really gives me pause. And that's the #1 priority for your party? I think that's a common sense approach that the founders would have agreed with, and that I hope it's already the approach of the Republican base. I hope it becomes the approach of the Republican Party leadership. I like breathing, so I'm not going to hold my breath for that. But as I also said, if the Republican Party needs to just kind of slip off into that good night and be replaced by a party who will prioritize the interests of its voters, I'm all for that too.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. This has been a very illuminating conversation, and it's a conversation that will continue, certainly in the pages of National Review, where Noah Rothman is a mainstay, in the pages of the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind, where you can find Michael Anton as a contributor, and of course, in the pages of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute's own publication, Modern Age, copies of which are available in the back of the room. You can also visit it online at modernAgeJournal.com. I want to thank the Diana Davis Spencer Foundation again, and also the Civitas Institute for hosting us here tonight. On behalf of ISI, I want to thank all of you. I also want to remind you that we have, in the emails that you received when you registered, you have a QR code, which will allow you to vote on the winner of this debate. There is also a copy of the QR code in the back by the copies of Modern Age. So if you don't have your email with you, do go and scan the QR code in the back, and you can cast your ballot that way. Thank you again.
Well, thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Excellent.
No, I was gonna, every time I do this, I always walk off with these things and then they go, hey. I know.
Important thing is just to take it off before you go to the back. Oh my gosh.